and thank you so much for being with me today.
Hey, Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Could you start by introducing yourself and just saying a little bit about, where you're standing or where you're coming from?
Yeah, my name's Aaron Prosper. I come from the Eskizoni First Nation. I've been residing in Halifax now for 12 years. I moved here in 2014. So I'm going on 12, onto the 13th. Um, yeah, and in the span of that time, I did my undergrad at Dal. Um, Worked like right before COVID and then throughout most of COVID, quite a few health policy related roles. So I managed a project on Mi'kmaq cancer care for a couple of years. I was the first Indigenous health consultant for Nova Scotia Health. Had some cool projects there. And then I worked for a stint as a manager for intergovernmental relations for DHW. And then from that point, in the middle of all that, I finished my master's at UPEI. And after finishing that, I went into med school. So now I'm at the very tail end of my first year of medicine. So I dropped all the work stuff, became a student again, and so that's sort of where I'm at. So I'm still in Halifax, still involved any way I can in the community. Uh, but my 9 to 5 right now is learning medicine and all the things that come with it.
What's motivating you to go to med school?
Oh gosh, so many things. Okay. My folks don't often know this. My mentor, who's near and dear to me, and honestly, I think fitting for our convo, was Dr. Ronald Stewart. And Dr. Stewart was our Minister of Health during the Dr. John Savage government. And so Ron, when he graduated in 1997 or 1970, he ended up practicing in Niels Harbor, Northern Cape Breton. And he had a moment, sort of an epiphany, which was that, we lacked services for emergency care. And at the time, in the 70s, there was quite literally nowhere in North America that recognized emergency services as a specialty.
Mm.
And so he had to go all the way to California, to LA County Hospital. And that's sort of where he gained his traction, his start. So he did his whole residency there, became the director of emergency services for LA County, and then he actually moved from there to Pittsburgh. And little known fact, he was the founder of the emergency department that the current show, The Pit, is like loosely based off of.
Really?
Yeah, so he's done like so much. But after he was done in Pittsburgh, he came back in the 90s, um, and he became our health minister, ended up becoming a prof at Dal, teaching emergency services, but created our like modern EHS system. And so I met Ron when I was in high school. And at the time, I was a little bit of a keener. So I'm going to go to med school. And then Ron was very much the type like, I'm going to convince you every reason why you shouldn't go to med school. And if at the end of it all you still say like I still want to do this, he's like, then we'll talk. Um, and that I think formed a lot of my decision making, but like really learning through someone like Ron is that like, that degree, and even being in my first year, the privilege you have to be able to help people um, in very different ways that you don't really get when you're in policy or like certain types of community work. It's very intimate. It's very, you quickly realize how much of a privileged position that you're in, even as a medical learner. And so you don't really take that for granted. They teach us all about that, but like, it's one thing to teach someone, it's another thing to experience it and say, okay, wow, like I'm doing these clinical experiences. So really for me, the motivation was like, I've had this whole many years in Indigenous health. Um, and I've always wanted med school, but I'm glad I sort of did it now that I'm 30, had a bit of life experience, and I feel like I can bring that in with me to then either service patients directly by like having a knowledge base of the system, or, with that knowledge base, as I begin to see key challenges in the system, having the know-how, not just on a policy end, but on like a clinical side of like how do we support change in the system. So I think really it's the motivation, just a natural progression of my career, sort of where it started. And then, being inspired by people like Ron to, who really saw medicine again as like that privilege place. Um, in privileged in the sense that like the ways you help people are unlike anything else. Um, and
Wow.
so, yeah, so that's sort of the motivation, like in a nutshell. I could give so many reasons, um, but the main one, at the start of the year, they asked us to do little video clips, and the thing that I said was sort of from Ron in his memoir. He says he talked about the importance of kindness in care, and really like, you know, when you're in medicine, even as a student, or let's say you're practicing, you can really get caught up in the hustle of it all. And the thing he always harped is just like, remember to be kind to your patients, because, um, and him as an emergency physician, I remember one time he said, like, it's not my job to tell a patient what's an emergency. My job is to treat them with kindness. He said, because, I can have a violin player that comes in and let's say they break their pinky. Well, to me as emergency physician, might not be an emergency, where we put them on the triage, list is different. But he said to that person, if that's their livelihood and that's what they do every day, and that's going to impact their ability to like live in the community, that's an emergency to them. And so he said, that's the compassion you need, is to see like where people are at, to treat them with that kindness, because knowing the system now, I've come to realize is like people don't show up to the doctor because they just want to.
Yeah.
They they go because something's happening. So, wanting, and having that frame of mind, I think is so important that, you know, can
You
get
really
lost a little bit. Yeah.
you bring so much to the table, and this was why I wanted to have a conversation with you for this podcast, because, thinking about your work like inside the system, and then now kind of approaching health from this other side of the system, but then also I know that you are also a musician,
Hmm.
because my husband is a musician, and you
Yeah.
are sometimes in the same band. And so and just and thinking about your community in Eskasoni, just like all of the kind of the lenses that you look at this place through
Mm.
is really interesting to me, because one of the things that I'm kind of deeply committed to is looking at the interconnections
Mm.
among all of us, all our communities and all our ways of being and showing up, and helping to make those kind of webs evident to people, so that we can have a real conversation about what's at stake in this place, and
Yeah.
how we want to kind of move forward together. And so I'm wondering, this is a huge question, but I'm wondering, like, as you reflect on um say the last couple of months here in Nova Scotia, what comes to mind for you about how the provincial government is interacting with Nova Scotians these days?
Yeah. Um, I think for me, well, I said it on CBC the other day, and it like from a Mi'kmaq context, it feels like Harper 2.0,
Huh.
if we're is sort of honest. And when you think about the Harper government era, we had, you know, probably the most formative or like the most substantive demonstration of Indigenous people across the country, which was like Idle No More. And that I think we forget about No More. But what we don't realize is that like the traction that gained, the impact that it had on, bringing in the Trudeau government, um, things like that. But that government and what it was is, I guess in my life of policy, term we would use or I've heard use is like bright line rules or bright line policies. And so this idea, like in any institution, the interpretation of policy or law or legislation is almost like to the word and taken sometimes literally, despite the fact that if there's a historical trend within community by which that policy is interpreted, um, what you get almost I found in the Harper government was these bright line rules. And so, you have a history on the reserve of the Indian Act. And actually, I think it was yesterday was the 150th anniversary of the Indian Act. So fitting um, to talk about it. But, this piece of legislation quite literally governs everything. And when you read like on the reserve, and when you read through it in all of its sections and its issues, um, it it reads in a way where the ultimate power at the end of the day lies not with Indigenous leadership, but with the minister responsible. Um, and that would be, in the terms of the Indian Act, the Minister of Indian Affairs, but now it's like, it's a split thing. It's, Indigenous Services Canada and it's Crown Indigenous Relations, two new departments. But um, the Harper government very much came in and said, well, it is our jurisdiction to enforce these things on the reserve vis-a-vis the Indian Act. And we're a little bit more black and white about it. Um, but that being said, when I think about these issues too, I don't, um, the liberal government or the liberal side is not without its challenges as well. Um, and I think the difference is that like, especially in a Trudeau government, having worked a little bit in government and dealt with that government, is you get issues by which um, a lot of things are said. These like what we call recognition politics. But when you boil it down to the nitty-gritty of policy or financing of policy issues, things like that, um, nothing really substantively changes. So the needle really doesn't move. And so you get the cyclical nature of like these discussions. And so you're always coming back to like, well, oh, we're on unceded Mi'kmaq land, and oh, we recognize your right to a treaty right. Okay, when can we practice that? How? Oh, well, we're on unceded land. We're talking in circles. Um, and why am I saying this? Because I do find that I suppose in the current provincial government, there is what I said on CBC, what's frustrating a lot of people is a selective nature by which this government decides to impose its provincial jurisdiction. And so what I mean by that is that, it's coming in, and obviously, like when we look at the Cannabis Act, yes, it is provincial jurisdiction. We can discuss the nuances of that. But when it came into being in 2017, the Mi'kmaq community, the chiefs did write letters to the McNeil government. Again, this is something that like, both sides of the aisle sort of own this issue. Um, and they reached out to McNeil government. The McNeil government said no. we're not going to engage with Mi'kmaq communities. You don't really see this in provinces by which they've engaged with community and had agreements in place around regulation, things like that. Like you're not getting these RCMP raids in other provinces. You are getting it in New Brunswick, um, which is, it's its own thing when we think of provincial jurisdiction. Um, so what you get is this provincial government coming in, imposing its jurisdiction in this respect. But when it comes to issues, let's say, that might be very clearly provincial jurisdiction with a little less ambiguity, one example might be healthcare. The interest by which this government wants to uh, use its muscles per se of its jurisdiction, there's like little to no interest. And the example I gave on CBC was that uh, in this government we had the Action for Health campaign. And even just the other day, I saw on the PC uh, website, they were sort of quoting statistics of like legacy statistics from Action for Health, like reducing wait times, things like that. But in this campaign, they did a whole series of town halls. And at the time, I was the Indigenous Health Consultant for NSH when they launched those. Um, and I remember sort of raising it to, the folks that I could raise it to is that not a single town hall in this series of community engagements were actually held on reserve,
Huh.
like not one. And then you get policies that sort of come out after this, and the big one that they sold to everyone was um, um, the nursing bonuses and sort of recruitment and retention incentives for healthcare workers. And what happened in that rollout is that uh, those individuals who worked on the reserve actually didn't qualify for any of these bonuses. So you get things like this that like, you know, okay, here's an opportunity for partnership to, um, you know, gain traction and make some improvements in the community and what you get is no, the answer sort of, as I understand it, was like, well, no, your federal jurisdiction. And which is in the nuances of Indigenous health policy and law, it's somewhat true, but this is what I mean again by like bright line rules is like, the selective nature by which someone might decide, well, this line in a policy says it's federal, but then you get things like healthcare where there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of gray area, a lot of ambiguity, because the reality is that the function of the federal government with respect to healthcare on the reserve is mostly primary healthcare and prevention, as well as disease prevention. Um, but when it comes to things like secondary, tertiary care, that's almost 100% the jurisdiction of the provincial government. So you can begin to see like in that complex web of like how you get a lot of overlap and there's a lot of issues. And those are just two examples. Like I could give so many, like, if you here in Nova Scotia, if you live on the reserve, um, there's a provincial policy. You can actually Google it. If you Google First Nations continuing care eligibility, it'll pop up for you at the Google search a PDF document. And what it tells you is that if you live on a reserve, despite the fact that everyone with an MSI card in Nova Scotia qualifies for continuing care, and Mi'kmaq people also have an MSI card, but if your address is on the reserve and you are status First Nation, you don't qualify for certain aspects of continuing care. And it's quite literally like we have policy in healthcare
Because the federal government is somehow supposed to be responsible for that, or just
that's the argument, that's the jurisdictional argument. Now,
and when you say continuing care, what do you mean? Like, what's an example of that?
like so home support, oxygen supplementation, chronic nursing services, acute nursing services. So like every individual that might go in, let's say, you have some operation by which you need regular wound care. They will work with that individual through a discharge planning process, vis-a-vis like a charge nurse. Um, in determining the needs of that patient when they go home. And so it's fairly complicated, but sometimes the services are contracted out to VON. Um, and there's various mechanisms by which that service then ends up with VON. Or the flip side would be that NSH or DHW would then provide that service. But essentially the idea is that like we're assessing this patient before they get home, and we're trying to make a determination on what their needs are. So, um, on the reserve, you do get cases by which, you have patients that have very substantive, like complex surgeries that require, follow-up and wound care, that often fall through the cracks because they don't qualify. And there's issues in sort of continuity of care. Like there's so many issues down the healthcare rabbit hole. But this is what I'm trying to lay it out in the sense that like, the complexity of some of the policies and programming in place. Essentially, what you get on the reserve is that because we don't have the same level of service access. And
Yeah.
all the data points show that, if NSH is launching a new program for community, a lot of the time they don't say like, you don't qualify for it. They'll say, yeah, if you come in with your MSI card, you'll qualify for it. But the problem is access. So, let's take Eskazoni where I grew up, or, the vast majority of the reserve communities in Cape Breton. Let's leave mainland aside, but even this still applies. But the majority of the communities, if not all of them, have no access to um, taxi services, or if it's available, it's minimal. There's no public transit. There's no public services. So if you struggle, with income and you can't access, let's say, Wi-Fi or computer, well, news alert, there's not a single library service on reserve in Nova Scotia. It doesn't exist, like non-existent. Um, there's, all of these public serve water is another issue. We talk about the health of water, capacity in that regard. So when you begin to see this landscape by which, you know, leadership in the community is then hamstrung on how do we then solve these issues because each of them are complex on their own. It requires then a network of, engagement and like solution finding to like, how do we move the needle to make improvement for our community? And the thing that like to me that maintains the status quo really is the fact that like despite what our communities give to like a lot of non-Indigenous communities, vis-a-vis the economy, whether that be like direct tax revenues, the data showing that like 90% of income that's earned in Indigenous owned businesses in Atlantic Canada are actually taxable or are taxed in some capacity. Like we're generating for the whole region of Atlantic Canada about $2 billion in taxes every year, split amongst, federal and provincial, but like the communities themselves don't actually get a say on how these resources are distributed. Um, so they then need to find workarounds to, engage with government. Here in Nova Scotia, we have what's called the tripartite. program or tripartite framework agreement. And that's involving Canada, province of Nova Scotia, and Mi'kmaq communities in the province. Um, and this is sort of a way by which we would then negotiate some of the ambiguities or negotiate some of the challenges that might exist. But the problem inherent in all of it really is that like these chief and councils, other than direct revenues from ban-owned businesses, don't really have a way to gain revenue or capital for the reserve to begin to solve these issues on their own. And this is why like you get this cyclical nature of like reliance on these relationships. So when you get a provincial government that comes in and it's like unwilling to like really have any sort of substantive collaboration, this is where you get a lot of these frustrations that are starting to come out.
So there's this like aspect of, you know, there are these areas in, say, healthcare
Mhm.
where the province was just like, oh, well, you can't access this, and you're technically eligible for it, but you can't access it, so you're functionally not eligible for it, or
Mhm.
that's not our jurisdiction, even though it kind of is. And then you compare that, say, with, and I think this is what you're getting at, the the granular level of interest the province is taking in, say, what's happening with cannabis,
Yeah.
right? And that there's
Yeah.
a disconnect there, or it's like, in this
Yeah.
case, they are saying, oh, yes, this is our jurisdiction and we want to get right in there and do something
Mhm.
about it. And in
Yeah.
this case, that would actually be helpful to people. They're kind of washing their hands of it. Is that some of what you're teasing out?
Yeah, that's some of what I'm saying. And in the granularity of it all too, it's the lack of collaboration. I know that there's been like discussions, things said in the media, like, but without FOIPOP, how do you actually know what's been said?
Right.
But between one party and the next. But um, it's been said that there's been some lines of communication, but as far as I understand it, if we take like the roadblocks the other day in that started in Bodlodek, my understanding was the chief there of Bodlodek and their council had no idea that this was going to happen.
Uh-huh.
The chief was actually down in meetings in Halifax that same day. Um, so there's like, you know, and that I think, the Chiefs have been fairly consistent on, I think, their approach and what they want. And that was like, if this is an issue, let's talk about it and let's collaborate. Um, but what I think you're getting and they've held that position even with the Liberal government. Like they
Right.
held that with Stephen McNeil government. And there was a lack of appetite even there to come in and discuss and negotiate. And it begs questions why. Like I do
Yeah.
wonder, does this, you know, um, I have a lot of questions, it'd be a lot of speculation as to like why there's no interest. I would be really curious, even in the McNeil government, when you had the opportunity to negotiate this and like actually resolve this, um, what was the motivation to say no?
Yeah.
Um,
And by this, you mean like whose jurisdiction or whether cannabis can be
Yeah,
sold?
whether it can be sold on the reserve, whether there would be different laws on the reserve, and this becomes the nuanced debate, I think, on you know never mind just cannabis, but leave cannabis aside. I think cannabis, like I as a healthcare professional, I need to like be responsible and divide out the issue a little bit. There's like the idea of like smoking cannabis and consuming it that like is harmful. It's talked about in my med school lectures. And it's like anything else. It's like smoking cigarettes, it's like alcohol. Um, you know, any human, if you take in something, ingest it, there is a level of risk inherent in that, and there's a consequence. And so that that's there. It's not going away, and it doesn't matter like, and then there's studies that show benefits too. But it's so complicated. And that's that side, the health side. Then there's this idea of treaty, and I would treat them like separately. Often like coming out, talking to like some of the people that support me or advise me is like needing to make that differentiation because like um the fear often even as a medical student is like, oh, they could frame you as like being a promoter of substance abuse and as
Right.
a healthcare professional. And it happens. But so in separating that, like there's the treaty issue. And what often gets lost in all of this, and you hear it relate to cannabis, you hear it relate to fisheries, you hear it relate to really any treaty issue, is um, this line within the Marshall decision, and it's actually Marshall 2, which stipulates that um, I guess treaty rights, specifically Mi'kmaq treaty rights, don't exist within a vacuum, and that they are subject to regulation, which is true. The Marshall decision does say this. What gets lost is the lines after that. And there's almost like a selective nature of the lines of the court that we want like people cherry pick, and you see this all the time. And if you go down, it says basically, yeah, it's subject to regulation, but you have to address key tests, legal tests, to justify whether or not you're infringing upon this right. And so the first one or test that they use is what's called a Badger test. And the Badger test in the courts comes from a case called RV Badger, is in relation to how you interpret a treaty. And there's a legalese in that decision, but to sort of put it in a way, it's that what it does say is that when it comes down to any ambiguities in terms of an interpretation of a treaty, it is the court's responsibility to then side with the tribe.
Huh.
That's essentially what it says. But it lays out a framework by which how you would interpret a treaty. The next is what's called the Sparrow test. And the Sparrow test is a test by which it is sort of the guidelines to which a government or entity would then infringe upon a right. This is the test by which you then justify um, if you are infringing and if you're able to even do that. And so how it works is um, obviously has to be justified. That justification can really only fall under two categories. One is environment. And so environmental preservation, let's say you have a endangered species, you can then impose regulation onto that. Or the other one is public safety. Essentially the two. The other thing it talks about is like this prima facie infringement upon a right, which is basically as I'm not a lawyer, but how I understand it is if on first glance at a policy decision, I then make the determination that this is infringing upon a right, then it can be interpreted as such. Is essentially what it's saying. Um, and then through this sort of test or procedure, it then makes like sort of a determination as to whether or not a government can then infringe upon that right. And the last little bit that sort of talks about is that you have to be able to prove, or like that burden of proof, that the infringement is justified is on the government or the infringer of that right. And so what you essentially have to show. Let's take lobster as an example because lobster's been very controversial species in the province. Under the sparrow test, technically what it says is that yes, province can regulate lobster fishery, but it has to justify it. And so how does it justify it? Well, it can say like based on conservation Well, if it's based on conservation, then what the government then technically in the eyes of the court, what it has to do is take steps such as imposing a quota or limitations on a commercial market before it actually infringes upon a treaty right. It has to show you the data that the lobster stock is actually endangered, that the act of practicing your treaty is imposing strain on that species. All these things, it has to sort of, the burden of proof is there. But what you get with all these issues, whether it be cannabis, lobster, forestry, etc., is none of these governments really um, going through that nuanced level of like justification for infringing upon a right. And what you get, especially in fisheries, um, is a case by which a lot of community members attempt to go and practice their treaty right, but that treaty right, um, in my opinion, is somewhat infringed upon, whether it be the province or DFO, in a whole suite of ways that essentially ties up the Mi'kmaq person into the court system almost in perpetuity. Um, One of the ways that this happens is actually through DFO investigations. And so what happens, so DFO will say like, oh yeah, Mi'kmaq people have the right to treaty fish and they have a right to a moderate livelihood. But what happens is that I know quite a few fishermen that will go out, put their traps out, spend thousands of dollars on gas, bait, traps, rope, etc., their boat, their team. They go out, they fish. The size of their fleet or, the number of traps might be 20, 30 traps compared to, let's say, the hundreds of traps that big commercial boats would have. So it's, a fraction of the market. But what you get is DFO going, they'll either cut the rope, cut your trap, and then it's like 200 feet at the bottom of the sea, or they pull them up and they say they're now under investigation. Under the law, DFO can then hold your traps in this sort of I don't know, let's call it escrow, can hold it there for a period of 1 to 2 years as it's under investigation. And
1 to 2 years.
yeah, and so typically what you get then is, these fishermen that get cash strapped, because they're all their investments tied up in DFO. And about a year to 2 years later, DFO will release all the traps. No charges ever laid. They just say our investigation's done. So you get a lot of, so, why am I talking about this? Well, the key question in some of these issues, in the current issue of like cannabis shops, it becomes like well, why cannabis shop? Why,
Yeah.
why? Well, to me, the answer is purely economic. If governments on a provincial or federal end essentially litigate Mi'kmaq treaties in perpetuity,
Yeah.
and you get this even in the media, like, like a lot of news organizations that the Mi'kmaq claim they have a right to moderate livelihood, or the so-called right, and it's like, no, it's not so-called. Supreme Court said we have a right. It's not ambiguous. Like the court said this. This is a problem in some of the narratives, but when you get this sort of stereotype and this type of jargon, and you get these issues by which literally, like, I would say, this is the way I put it, when Don Marshall Jr. was acquitted, he wasn't acquitted of catching eels. He was acquitted of selling eels. Very key difference. Um, and in that acquittal, the court says he has a right to a moderate livelihood. So that to me is creates the assumption that to generate that livelihood, you need access to the market. You need an ability to sell what you catch. And to this day in Nova Scotia, it is still illegal unless a Mi'kmaq person abides by some commercial framework agreement that they've made with the between, the reserve and a government, every other form of treaty fishing in order to sell it is viewed as illegal in the eyes
Huh.
of the government. So, essentially what you could say is I can be charged, me, Aaron, as a Mi'kmaq, can be charged with the exact same things that the Supreme Court acquitted Donald Marshall Jr. of over 25 years ago. Um, and so this is sort of the state of treaty relations in Nova Scotia, really all of Atlantic Canada, is that you never really had a period by which Mi'kmaq treaties are actually fully realized, um, for a whole suite of reasons. But the main one being that like they don't grant access to the market. I talked about the DFO, like the federal side. On the provincial side, how it works is that typically what they will do is they will actually litigate not the fishermen, but the buyers of fish. Um, and as doing that in that way, so they will charge them for buying treaty fish and then putting them onto the commercial market. And so what happens is it sort of scares these potential buyers to then engage with our community on any type of treaty fishing. And
So then it
so,
just thwarts a Mi'kmaq person's ability to derive that moderate
yeah,
living because it
100%.
erases it puts a chill on the market, basically.
Yeah, 100%.
Huh.
Happens all the time.
And so the cannabis piece of that is like, okay, if we can't access that market to sell lobster, we'll access this market to sell cannabis. Is that the connection for you?
A little bit,
Huh.
but it's also more like broader economics of the community. And
Okay.
so what I mean by that is that, um, the job market on reserve is primarily government derived, I want to say, in this, like, whether it be like your indigenous government, so chief and council, provincial or federal, through various agreements. So it's derived primarily from that. But the opportunities for private business and private jobs is like almost non-existent. And there's a few reasons for that. Um, One is that under the Indian Act, your capacity to have private business is strapped because there's certain stipulations within the Indian Act that actually prevents you from using reserve lands for business purposes. You actually have to go through a process by which you obtain approval from your chief and council, and it gets signed off by the minister. So I can't just go in and say, like, I have this plot of land, Aaron, my family lived there for, 80 years. I'm going to start a business of whatever kind on this piece of land. It doesn't sort of work that way. You're really not allowed. These are some of the challenges that exist. But the other thing too is um, the economic makeup of the reserve is very different than off the reserve. I talked about like public services. Um, there's a suite of reasons why those don't exist. But also when it comes to like the private economic market, um, in the eyes of a bank, any property on the reserve essentially has no capital or equity, like zero.
Ah,
And so this is because under the eyes of the Indian Act, reserve lands are not necessarily owned by any one individual, but are in Indian, like an indigenous person who lives on the reserve is in possession of a plot of land, which is different.
okay.
And even then, not every person living on a plot of land would be recognized as being even in possession of it. They might be a tenant of a plot of land or a house by which it's owned or, governed by chief and council, thus the federal government. So what does this mean? Well, let's say, say I'm a young man. I'm really interested in cars. This is the example I gave on the CBC. I'm really interested in cars and I want to become a mechanic. Well, mechanic tools are expensive. They're really pricey. And maybe there's no mechanic shop on the reserve. Doesn't exist. Nobody's tried it. Nobody's so you're like, you know what? There's a good, viable business. A lot of cars in Escazone. I want to start my own mechanic shop. Well, how do you do that? Well, you need that investment, that upfront capital from, your physical space, all of your tools. Maybe you got to hire someone. That's extremely hard to do if you don't have like the same level, like savings, like if you don't have in any type of like intergenerational wealth.
Right.
It's very difficult to do. So if you're in that position, what do you do? Well, people go into private business all the time. They might remortgage their home if they own a home. They might use the home as collateral to get a loan. They might do things like this by which they can gain that upfront capital to then make that investment to like jumpstart their business. If you lived on the reserve, you have no ability to do that. There's no way to do that because the bank doesn't there because of the law, the bank has no ability to use that house or plot of land as that collateral, etc. So you're hamstrung. So, go back to that young man, what does he do? If he's into cars and he wants to be a mechanic, he can, I guess, go to the neighboring non-Indigenous town, sure if that's feasible for him. But, in terms of access or generation of, any sort of economy and wages, even vis-a-vis the private market on the reserve doesn't exist. There's no way to do it. Now, there are exceptions to the rule all the time. Like there's private businesses on the reserve. I don't want to say that there's not private business, but those examples are so few and far between. And often it's the result of somebody being able to like, my neighbor growing up was a businessman. And he actually made a lot of his initial investments off the reserve. And so he had to go outside of the reserve. He was actually a member of the Cape Breton Chamber of Commerce, really smart guy. Leonard Paul was his name. And he made those investments off the reserve and then was able to generate business from going off reserve generated on reserve. He's my grandfather's godson, and he was a smart man, a business guy. But, you know, to that example, he still had to go off the reserve to generate a lot of that capital
In order to then be able to bring
and
something
yeah,
back into his home community and
yeah.
make it work there. So
So
there's
that
incredible barriers to
yeah.
everything.
Yeah, everything. And so that again, it goes back to that like why cannabis shops? Well, if you have a community by which you're economically hamstrung from, you know, your ability to utilize and gain any sort of advantage in the natural resources, fish, water, wildlife, etc., private business. You're hamstrung on a public sector lens. You don't have public services. Your access to public goods are limited. A lot of reserves don't even have grocery stores. Um, that becomes an issue. Um, you have no way to generate as a government your own revenues vis-a-vis like tax dollars. So like, for every individual, let's say going through like Millbrook gas station, if you pay tax on that, that's not going to the reserve. That's going to, that's the HST and how it's divvied up between, harmonized sales tax between the province and the feds all goes to them. Not a single penny goes to Millbrook. Um, so, these are the challenges really so when I look at this budget, like, we're cutting things like access to language, when we're cutting tripartite, we're cutting transition year program. Like to me, that was so absurd. Like, on what earth do we have a program that's, started by Rocky Jones, been here for over 30 years, very successful, graduates every year, good retention rate. It is a pillar of, Halifax community, just as if somebody with a Sharpie just decided to go, "Phew, I'm going to cross it out with no context." Like, how does that happen? Like, and so I think it's very obvious why people get frustrated because, you know, the lack of engagement on a community level, just in this budget as a whole, the lack of engagement with community for very community-based things, yet there seems to be a big appetite for like big business, which will change the fabric and dynamic of the economy of Nova Scotia in a substantive way without having that public engagement is what I think is fueling a lot of the frustrations. And I think it's treating people, when I look at the news sort of question periods, um, I think it treats Nova Scotians as if they're naive to the realities of Trump. But
Uh-huh. Whoa, say more about that. What do you mean?
um, I think
Because I
that,
think that too, but I want to hear what
yeah,
you mean.
I think there's this assumption that Nova Scotians don't know what's best for their future
Uh-huh.
because they don't understand the impact that Trump's going to have. And I believe a lot of the opposite. I believe that Nova Scotians, every walk of life, they do understand Trump. They do understand the impact. Um, but I also think they understand like, where this world is going, how it's going to change the economic framework of like our society and our community. Like you go into the States, everything's in an AI bubble.
Yeah.
Everything's in big corporations, Apple, Amazon, Tesla, etc. Billionaires really moving the market. Um, and I think here in Nova Scotia, like we're still fortunate and lucky to have a very community-based economy.
Yeah.
And okay, in the grand scheme of things, in that community-based economy, if we are hyper-reliant on supply chains that are not reliable, okay, that's a fair discussion. Let's talk about it. Um, and let's go into the nuances of how we make that transition. If we want shorter supply chains, if we want improvements in certain aspects of the community so that, we don't have supply chains that are then precarious because of, Trump decides tomorrow he's going to put 100% tariff on it. Okay, I think those are fair discussions, and I think Nova Scotians are willing to have those discussions.
But we're not
But
having those discussions, are we?
but they're not. Yeah, that I think that's inherent in the problem. It's like, had the government gone out and made all these cuts, but let's say in theory did like a series of town halls by which, they were just upfront to say like, we have to make these cuts. We have to, you know, maybe it's 10% across the board everywhere as a starting point, and then we're gonna figure out where we go from there. And I think giving community the opportunity to say, like, this is what's important to our community. This is what we want to preserve. Like, I don't like going back to TYP. I don't think there'd be anyone who knows that program that would say, cut TYP. It's a good idea. Like, no, it was a
And,
horrible idea.
and this is the transition year program is a program that was in place at DAL that helped uh, African Nova Scotian, Black Nova Scotian, in Indigenous, Mi'kmaq Nova Scotians come through into medicine and law, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
like an amazing program
Hmm.
that doesn't generate any revenue,
None. Yeah.
except that it does eventually generate revenue because it is, this kind of
Yeah.
functional piece of our society that is allowing students to access their education in a supported way that is going
Yeah.
to set them up for the best success into these professions where their presence is their presence is needed and wanted.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we should definitely have cut that.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about artists in the schools as well.
Yeah.
This program that required a tiny amount of money to deliver this incredible benefit to
Mm.
every school kid in every corner of Nova Scotia. No path to revenue
Yeah.
except for the like ineffable, incredible benefits that it returned.
Oh, yeah, I was reading like it didn't get put into the CBC segment that got put out, but I remember saying to Jeff, like look at the cuts to art, like arts and culture, and what's lost, like what folks might look at it is like, okay, I give this artist whatever grant, $15,000. Okay, well, they can look at that on a direct way and say, well, that's $15,000 lost from and could spend it somewhere else. But what they don't realize is the indirect benefits to that. Because like the economy of an artist here is very reliant on grants, grant structure. Why is that? Because the bottom line of the service industry is quite thin. And I don't think artists are wanting to go to, these local businesses and drain them any more than they have to, or like, there's some mutual exchange there, but, you know, they want to make sure that they have a venue to play at. And so they're not going to go, here in Halifax, like there's so many music venues and in pubs and restaurants, but like on a week to week, and I think COVID showed us this, like the bottom line for those businesses, is quite thin, can be precarious, but they work incredibly hard to maintain where they're at and deliver a service to the community. What people don't realize is that, okay, that 15,000 you pay to that uh that artist to grow a project, then let's say they start going into these restaurants and into these venues. Well, then that 15,000 is then helping you get people in the door in a private business. It's hiring the servers, it's hiring a bartender, it's hiring security, it's hiring chefs, it's hiring promotion, it's hiring a sound guy, it's hiring extra musicians that might support that artist. Like, the once you get the web,
Yeah,
you're
the
like,
printer that makes the posters, the guy that
yeah,
does the t-shirts and the ball caps and
everything.
the yeah,
Yeah,
the rent that that artist pays out of that 15 grand while they're living, all
yeah,
of the groceries
all
they
of it.
buy. Yeah.
And I think it's lost. And yeah, it's sort of back to that issue of like, I think we have a very community-based economy,
Yeah.
and it's I think the frustration that these things are tr being treated almost as a drain to the system, which I think, when you think, let's critique the current budget, like um this government started with a surplus coming from the, McNeil government. We're now in a deficit. Okay, like it's fair criticism. How do you go from one government to the next and generate a deficit when you were in a surplus? Where did you spend your money? How did you spend your money? What specifics were you ensuring that you got a return on investment for the spending, or were you spending for the sake of a political gain? Were there's so many, I think, like just valuable basic questions that can be asked. And I think people begin to feel frustrated that like they're the chopping block for something that and treated as the drain on the system, when in reality they probably had nothing to do with the financial position of the province to begin with.
And in fact are contributing. I mean, you started our
Yeah.
conversation by talking about the economic impact that Mi'kmaq communities have in the Nova Scotia economy, and
Yeah.
I could say the same about the impact on the economy that the arts and culture and heritage sector has. It's not
Mhm.
insignificant. It was a very functional part of our provincial economy, and as you've said, these changes that have been made in the budget are a way of um, making these substantial changes to what our economy is made
Yeah.
of and what it relies on. And it's relying, it's a move toward extraction, um, and you know, a lifting of the ban on uranium, and we're talking about
Mhm.
fracking again, and it's very retro. We've been
Yeah.
down this road. When you just before I let you go, like when you look at those kinds of decisions through a treaty lens and through the lens of somebody who's operating on, kind of a lot of different sides of healthcare,
Mhm.
what are you thinking when you look at that change in focus
Um,
for this government?
well, I guess the first one is like the environmental racism piece.
Yeah,
I was in all the criticisms in the world, when we see, I view myself as politically homeless. Um, and so when there's things that do come up that I'm like, okay, that this is good, or I feel it's good, I'm happy to say it. And so there was an announcement around funding for engagements on the environmental racism report, which I think was a positive step. Now that if that's the only thing, then okay, not good. Because I think we need to talk about like that environmental racism piece, the impacts on community. Let's take, Boat Harbor as an example. Um, the health impacts of Boat Harbor, quite substantive. And the researchers like Dr. D. Lewis, Mi'kmaq researcher, she did found quite a bit vis-a-vis freedom of information requests, figuring out and determining that the government actually was aware of the health impacts of some of these things, like the paper mill. So they knew about it, but they put a lot of the researchers on gag orders, and they sort of embargoed a lot of the data until years later, and through Dr. Lewis's work was able to uncover it. Um, so these are things I think like, you know, in an ideal world, again, it goes back to like these supply chains. Like, I guess trying to be pragmatic about it. Like, if there's things in reality that we need to function as Nova Scotians every day, and we have it here in Nova Scotia, okay, let's have a serious conversation about what that looks like. But for me, it's like, let's not pull it out of the ground for sake of pulling it out of the ground. I think
especially
to
to
me,
send the wealth somewhere else.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so for me, it's like, can we make it homegrown? Can we do it in a way that's environmentally safe? Can we do it in a way that community is actually informed about like how this is environmentally safe? How is it different? What are the safeguards? If the rails go off, what is the recourse that public can have to ensure that um, that they are safe, because you do see this in the States, like communities by which, they drill for the sake of drilling. Some environmental disaster happens, and then, you know, 20 years later, everyone has cancer. Like, and there's no like recourse that these individuals have because they're not given any. Um, and so I think, this is like the stigma on Mi'kmaq communities often is like we're not in favor of development. And I think that
Putting the
the
no
op
in Nova Scotia, I think, is how
yeah.
the premier puts it. It's very
Yeah.
catchy.
But, to me it's not true. It's like, I think communities are in favor of development. They just don't want development for the sake of development, and they don't want it, feeling that the government's not taking community-based concerns into consideration. Um, and that's where I feel like disappointed with even this last budget process. So when things get questioned, there's like a lot of hostility, there's like frustration with the questions. And I'm just like, yeah, no, like these are fair questions that every Nova Scotian has the right to ask in this democracy of our province. And I think we deserve a fair answer to a lot of them. If if we're going to bring in big corporations, are we hamstrung to that corporation for, 30, 40 years? Like just take the paper mill as an example. Like it took, I remember when I really thought the McNeil government wasn't going to end the pulp mill. And I think Northern Pulp really thought they were just going to continue with the status quo. And it took an incredible amount of courage to just say no, like we gave you every chance in the book to clean up your act, to find alternatives to make this place safer, stop, impacting the health of the community. I'm going to finally say no. But that happened in the middle of COVID. That was 30 plus years in the making. Like
Yeah.
it didn't, so, we're going to bring in new corporations. Are we stuck with them for 30, 40 years? And what's the impact on that? Like, I don't think anybody knows. Some of these are really complicated things that require, multiple researchers, community engagement, discussion. Um, that I don't think we're having. Um, and I know there's a crisis with supply chain, but like I think we could put in the work, even if it wasn't the premier. Like, why can't you get your MLAs to go and have a town hall? You
Yeah.
know, um, it's that simple. Have that town hall, get your ministers to go out, share the load a little bit. Like, you know. I would love to see that. Like to me, I would love and it's not about like putting anyone on a hot seat. It's about like opening up a discussion, making people feel like they can, be heard or feel like and contribute to what that is. This government actually showing us that they're engaged with the concerns of community. Like to me, like that's my frustration in this budget is like Trump's here, and you guys don't know what this means. And we need to change a whole economic foundation of this province, no matter what.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, there's so many ways you could take this, but yeah, to me, it's where do we go from here? On the Mi'kmaq side, I don't think things are done. Um, I think there will still be a lot of different challenges, but what I think you'll see a lot more from the Chiefs and from Mi'kmaq communities, a little bit more assertion to those jurisdictional issues that I talked about, and a little bit more clearly saying, no, this is a Mi'kmaq community, Mi'kmaq land, um, and asserting whether or not province has jurisdiction over this, over the reserve lands, and could that go to litigation? I have no idea. Like, that's in the future, but um, if it did, that could be a fairly landmark, thing that could happen. But who knows? Like, who knows where it goes? My hope is like cooler heads prevail, that we maintain the tripartite forum. But yeah, the challenges for me, like my hope at the end of the day, like for my community is like, if I grew up in Eskasoni. I love my community. I love being from Eskimo. I love Halifax. I've been here 12 years. But um, in the beauty of it all, it's still also hard in terms of the current landscape of the economy and getting by. And for me, it's like my wish is that, that there's partnership and interest and support to say, like if there's a young Mi'kmaq person coming up, whether it be through high school or what have you, that they get the same fair shake um to life and, you know, contributing and having a sense of purpose as anyone off the reserve. And what that looks like for everyone is different. What is finding that purpose, but you know, to me, it's like not everyone, I'm in medicine. It's not for everyone, realistically. Like, university, not for everyone. Maybe your path is college. Maybe your path is, you know, something different, arts, music. Maybe you go straight out of high school, start your own business. Like, who knows? There's so many options that are great, for someone to explore. But for me, it's like these policies, whether it be in this budget or like how Mi'kmaq communities are treated, don't really give, Indigenous young people the same chance or the same shot as, you know, other communities. And the idea of like, intergenerational wealth, like it doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Um,
This is
and
the time to, it can start building now.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
for me, it's like, that young Mi'kmaq person that, you know, if they're in grade 10 and they have hopes and dreams of when they graduate grade 12, that they can feel confident that they can achieve that. Um, and that they don't feel pigeonholed, It's I don't talk a lot about it, but like little personal, like I grew up through the suicide crisis in Eskasoni. And a lot of there's some folks that were my friends. I went to school with them, two of them in particular, but um, that having experienced that, especially close friends, the sense you get that like, what pushes someone to go there. Um, and for me, it's always like not having a sense of purpose and belonging within your community, whether it be within your community or like, the ability to go outside. And one of those young guys actually, it was like month or two. I had actually just gotten elected into the student union. And so through the summer, so first president was like my Dal famous moment, got elected, and I ran into him back home in Eskasoni, and he was like, "Oh, it's so cool that you're doing this, um, and it's so cool that you're able to finally leave this, get out of here, and find some opportunities that are different." And I remember me and him, yeah, we had this whole, like 20-minute talk, and how cool he thought it was, and 2 months later, he committed suicide, and it was hard. It's still hard on me today, but you know, it did that experience is something that motivates me, deep down. I don't talk a lot about, but it's something that, I think of him. His name was Levi, uh, and thinking about Levi, I don't want another Levi. So is what I want. And for me, that's the motivation is, Indish kids need a chance too. And but not just Indish kids, like everyone, every community feel respected, feel like they have purpose. And so when we're having budgets that are like, you know, lack that empathy, and can have a real impact on people's lives and livelihoods and their sense of purpose in the community. Like, what are we doing? And so for me, it's like those are my motivators. At the end of the day, like I could talk a lot about policy and law and whatever, but like on a human side, it's like, what's the humanness about all these issues? And you know, truly, I believe, like at the end of the day, like the foundation of what we should be doing is giving people hope, hope for tomorrow, hope for a future, hope that like, if you own a home, tomorrow you're still gonna have that home. Uh, sense of belonging, that you belong to a community, that we facilitate that you find meaning in that community and that you have purpose. And if you have those four things, like, you have a healthy community, you have a healthy person. And so for me, it's like those are the things I think about, when nobody's looking, what's on my mind? It's those things. It's like, you know, um, and so that would be like my message to this government, really. It's like, you know, back to, Mi'kmaq communities, instead of these like, we're gonna come in and we're gonna enforce the Cannabis Act. Well, like, okay, I'll debate you any time of the day on the nuance of that. Let's step back. Let's have like compassion for the issue. How do we get here in the first place? And what are some mutual things that we can work on that are both a concern and go forward there and start along the way coming to understand each other um, in these other issues. To me, that's like inherent in the everybody co-ops two-eyed seeing.
Yeah.
Um, to me, that's what two-eyed seeing is. It's not like, often we're talking about like this integration of worldviews. It really isn't that. Two-eyed seeing, the Edwaptamunk literally means like I see both sides. And the metaphor that's used is like Western versus Indigenous. But Edwaptamunk can apply to two people who just have totally different opinions
Mm.
and wanting to see the other side, and understand that and be intentional. And to me, I think we need a little bit more of that.
Aaron, it has been just incredible to get to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for everything that you brought. Thank you for telling us about Levi,
Oh, yeah.
for bringing Levi into the room,
Yeah.
and your your hopes for your community and for all our communities. It's just been, I feel like I could talk to you all day.
No,
So
likewise.
thank you so
No.
much for this, Will Allen.
Well, Alan.